So the fundamental equation that I want you to consider tonight is called IPAC. You may well know about it. It's the impact equals the population times the affluence times technology. What that means is that our footprint, our ecological footprint, is equal to the combination of three things: the population in an area, the level of affluence as we measure it by GDP, or particularly around consumption and resource use, and then technological efficiency of using such resources. In essence, that is how we measure our footprint and our impact, although, as I'll say a little later, there's a few more complex measures when it comes to footprint. But in essence, it's just those three things. And if you change any one of those three things on one side of the ledger, then you change the other thing, the overall impact, which is the big one. That's the stuff that we need to ensure fits, otherwise we're looking at the end of our civilization as we know it. And so this footprint stuff, some of you may also have heard about the Global Footprint Network, that for a number of years now has actually been looking at this stuff in terms of the demand of human populations, as well as the yield of the biocapacity of the Earth. And in fact, the data has just come out again in the last few weeks, the new report, the 2010 Global Footprint Network's report, which reports back 3 years in arrears. So the data for 2007 is out. And this is the fundamental thing that even people often in this sphere don't seem to be able to grapple with in terms of its full repercussions. What the data says is that currently the demand in terms of our footprint is at 2.7 global hectares per person. Now the global hectares equation is a little bit more complex than hectares, but it's not too dissimilar. So for the sakes of arguments, let's think about it just in terms of the space of hectares. 2.7 hectares is the global footprint at the moment. The footprint that the Earth will allow in terms of its regenerative capacity, in other words, the footprint that will allow us to continue living, that will actually be sustainable, is 1.7 global hectares per person. We've overshot it, and we've overshot it dramatically. And in fact, this year, we had a very important day on the 21st of August, and it wasn't because it was the Australian election. It was because 21st of August 2010 was the Global Overshoot Day. It meant that by the 21st of August this year, we actually had used all the resources that the Earth can regenerate in a year's time by that point. All the rest of it was dead. All the stuff we were using after that was borrowed. And this is interesting for me because I was born in 1982, and that's in fact the date, roughly, when we moved past the threshold, when we actually moved into overshoot, 1982. So, disregarding the fact that there was a very inequitable distribution of natural resource use in 1982, it was at that point in time that we actually had something that could have been sustained if not for the trajectory, just in terms of the actual footprint. One way to think about this is if you imagine the Earth in its entirety as $1 million charity, a charity worth $1 million. Now it's common these days for charities to put aside some money and to put it into a fund that allows them to live off the interest. Imagine the world as a $1 million charity that for many centuries has provided interest, as in regenerative capacity, things that allow us to live, with the outsource of energy from the sun. And essentially what we're saying here is that since 1982, we've actually been eating into the capital. The $1 million has been shrinking. And we all know from basic maths that when you shrink the capital, the interest gets smaller as well. So the fact is that the overshooting is accelerating. Next year, who knows what date the global footprint is going to exceed a threshold. But it will be before, given current trends, unless there's another global financial crisis, it will be before August 21st. And that trend, apart from the statistical outlier of the GFC, is one that's an exponential trend. That therein is the feedback loops as well, that we know come with climate change. So these important things, the fact that we've overshot, is something that's been talked about in many ways quite a lot, but the repercussions, to me, are quite simple and striking. And even more importantly, just thinking a little bit more broadly, this is a pretty incredible thing when you think about it. The development sector, one of the gold standards beyond gross domestic product, although it's a factor in this, is the Human Development Index. And it looks at a range of indicators. It came in the early 1990s, looks at a range of indicators around health, education, and GDP. Now, there is not one country in the world with a high level of human development, as in over 0.8 as it's measured by the UNDP. There's not one country that has a high level of human development and has a carrying capacity or a footprint which is within the Earth's carrying capacity. Not one. That is a pretty scary thing when you think about it. Not one country in the world is living sustainably. And that's something that is also little talked about. Across low-income countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries as groups, not one of these groups is actually undershooting. They are all overshooting. All of them. And that's not something that you hear often. In the low-income countries, it's only just a little bit overshooting. Middle-income countries, a little bit more. In the high-income countries, quite a bit of overshoot, but you actually have differences of biocapacity in different countries too. But all across the board, there's overshoot. Now, more recently in Australia, people like Ross Gittins, as you may know, have come and said, well, we can have the end of growth. It's important we get something like the end of growth on the agenda. But, he argues, this isn't about limiting GDP. Rather, he says we can see the end of growth whilst we maintain increases in GDP by increasing productivity. So essentially, we can do things in a more productive way. Technology, etc., is going to leave us the ability to grow within limits. Creative capitalism, all these sorts of things that you hear a lot of the time from big business, that essentially we don't need to stop growth, we just need to put more money into innovation. Well, there's three things I want to say about that tonight, because I think that argument, which has been going on for quite some time, is extremely dangerous and extremely flawed. The first is work done by a gentleman named Tim Jackson. He's a professor at the University of Surrey, but prior to that he was the chair of the Sustainable Development Commission in the UK. I came across a paper of his a few years ago, which was only 4 pages, but I think it's one of the most important papers I've ever seen. What it said was that if we continue to grow, let's say, at an average of 2% per annum, countries across the world, on average, up until 2050, then the amount that we would actually have to innovate and decarbonise, so reduce our carbon footprint throughout that, is 11% per year, every year, up to 2050. 16 times the rate at which we've been decarbonising since 1990 to now. Now, I did my PhD looking at nanotechnology globally. I looked at just about everything I could get my hands on in terms of technological innovation. You know, who was doing this? What was the reality about this? Is this just hot smoke, etc.? I'm telling you as someone who's assessed the global landscape, not as a scientist, but as a social scientist, but looking at the claims, I don't think you will find anywhere any credible scientist who says that we can decarbonise that quickly, at all. Now, if you take that for a second and just think about that, we can't decarbonise and innovate fast enough to keep our trajectory sustainable, or to in fact reach a sustainable trajectory through innovation alone. If that sinks in, all of a sudden that changes the game. And Ross Gittins and others need to look a little bit more deeply if that's the case. The second reason is what's called Jevons paradox. And that says that if you increase the efficiency of a technology, it will be outpaced by the increases in consumption. And the one to think about here is the promises during the 80s and 90s of the paperless office. So, how many of you remember the paperless office was put forward as something that was going to come through? Well, what happened? More communications, more paper, because the energy efficiency increased. And as a result, people thought they'll use it more. And the same thing is said, without pricing indexes taken into consideration, the same thing can be said for energy efficient cars, energy efficient just about anything. You're going to use it more. on the whole. So that's the second point. And the third is something that I've become more interested in over the last year, and that's what I call the ceiling of corporate social responsibility. What I mean there is that imagine that by 2050, alongside each big multinational that is actually having a massive carbon footprint, let's say, the multinationals that are in that camp, alongside each they have a social business, a charity, for example, that is doing fantastic work on the ground, wherever. There's a danger that comes from this idea of creative capitalism and social business on the side, etc., that, you know, we're a good company because we've got this business along the side of us that's doing this good work. There's a danger that we fall into the trap of having a whole range of multinational companies that are still essentially raping the earth, but at the same time they're untouchable. No one wants to touch them because, oh look, you know, Coca-Cola here, but look, they're running this cocaine addiction program here called Coca-Colette, you know, fantastic, can't touch them. And this is a future, I think, that we're moving to rapidly because business doesn't get it. Because business, as we know it, not just has to change off its path, has to change dramatically. A fundamental different kind of business, and that's what I want to talk a little bit more about tonight.